January 1944. Inside a cold, cramped hut south of Bristol, an American general sits through a briefing so audacious it forces a sideways smile and a muttered warning. The British have gone mad. That line, recorded later by an officer present, captures the disbelief in the room. In front of them, British engineers spread maps and models and described how they would build entire harbors, onshore and afloat, tow them across the channel and assemble them beside Normandy. For men schooled to count tanks and troops, the idea sounded like fantasy. For Britain, exhausted by 4 years of war and hard practical experience, it was the sober answer to a brutal problem: how to supply an invasion when ports were denied. What those American generals saw that winter would not simply be clever theatrics. It would force a rethink of assumptions about how wars are won. Skepticism would give way to grudging interest to measured adoption, and adoption to a deeper respect that shaped decisions on D-Day and after. This is the story of that transformation, the surprised faces, quiet recalculations, and the slow recognition that British readiness, in its meticulousness and oddities, could be the partner to American aggression. If you love hidden military moments that changed big decisions, consider liking and subscribing. There are more deep dives like this coming. January 1944, south of Bristol. The Mulberry Harbor briefing begins with a simple but radical premise. If ports are denied to an invasion force, build a port that floats. The British engineers unfurled diagrams of block ships, concrete caissons, floating piers, and roadways. They described components with names that would later be spoken in dry, admiring tones: Phoenix caissons, bombardons, and the floating roadway units that would become the Mulberry Harbors. To American engineers in the room, the plan raised immediate practical objections. How do you tow concrete blocks across a channel that can batter anything with a storm? How will they stay aligned under wave and weather? Captain Edward Elberg, an American salvage expert, listened and worried about the salvage and engineering complexities. Others worried about how long such structures would last under fire and the strain of supplying a large and eager force. The math was hair-raising. The British envisioned creating a logistical artery capable of handling thousands of tons of supplies daily without access to a captured port. To men who had operated with the assumption that ports were the keystones of sustainment, it seemed a gamble. Yet what tempered the room's laughter was scale. Practical, grim calculations of what it would take to keep an invasion force alive on a hostile shore. Losses in the first 48 hours would be measured in men and days. Without a steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, Lodgren would wither. The Mulberry concept answered an operational question in a way that struck planners as audacious and, increasingly, necessary. Eisenhower, who had observed British methods in planning since 1942, was not the kind to be swayed by flourish alone. But he had come to respect painstaking attention to contingency. His is the phrase that often appears in the files: an infinite capacity for taking pains. That capacity, shown in painstaking drawings and rehearsed contingencies, began to chip away at American skepticism. March 1944. The landscape for proving ideas shifted from huts to firing ranges and beaches. Percy Hobart, a British major general with a reputation for imaginative engineering, arrived with what American officers would call funnies, tanks modified into tools rather than pure weapons. They looked odd on parade: a Churchill tank with flails spinning ahead to clear mines, another with a canvas flotation screen that made it amphibious, tanks fitted with bridges to roll over obstacles, and armored bulldozers meant to clear the beach, create exits, and keep the tide of men moving inland. The first American reactions were audible. Officers who had never seen such contraptions snorted or called them theatrical, a solution searching for a problem. But Hobart was not selling gimmicks. He was selling risk mitigation. At rehearsals, the ability of a flail to clear a mined lane transformed casualty projections for an assaulting battalion. The swimming tank, dubbed duplex drive, offered the promise of armor on the beachhead in the early minutes of an assault when ordinary tanks could not yet be landed. Those minutes, planners increasingly understood, were mortal minutes. Omar Bradley, characteristically pragmatic, watched the demonstrations and weighed them against casualty estimates. He refused wholesale adoption. Tanks that swam were not a panacea, and some funnies were impractical in certain coastal conditions. But Bradley recognized that selected innovation could alter the calculus of the first hours ashore. He authorized measured use. That decision, neither full embrace nor dismissal, became emblematic of the American response: skeptical, numerate, and ultimately pragmatic. The demonstrations exposed a cultural fault line as much as a technical one. British doctrine had, by 1944, been shaped by years of defensive struggle, evacuation, and resource scarcity. Data were kept, alternatives cataloged, and plans layered with contingencies. Rehearsals mattered. The British rehearsed to identify weak links, and they wrote contingency plans in excruciating detail. American commanders often took a different view. Bolstered by industrial might and a culture that prized audacity and initiative, many Americans trusted in momentum, improvisation, and the ability to punch through an obstacle once in contact. If one method favored painstaking elimination of uncertainty, the other trusted decisive action to create opportunity. Dwight Eisenhower's memos and the notes of his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, capture this contrast without caricature. Bedell Smith, a figure who insisted on paperwork as a means to survive the chaos of war, recorded the tension between "we do it by doing" and "we plan to prevent doing." For American generals, the British emphasis on models, maps, mock-ups, and endless briefings could look like paralysis by analysis. For British planners, American improvisation sometimes appeared reckless, a refusal to respect the arithmetic of logistics. Then a rehearsal went catastrophically wrong, and the argument shifted from theory to life and death. Exercise Tiger, April 1944, off Slapton Sands, was meant to be a full-scale dress rehearsal for the Utah beach landings. Landing craft would practice the beach assault and the seaborne coordination required for D-Day. On the night of the exercise, a group of German E-boats intercepted the convoy. In a chaotic night attack, hundreds of American servicemen were killed and many landing craft were destroyed. Communications failed, coordination broke down, and the rehearsals that were meant to iron out details revealed vulnerabilities that no map could paper over. The immediate American reaction was grief and anger. Questions of blame and operational security took center stage. But the British response, methodical inquiry into what went wrong, adjustments in procedure, better identification, and convoy discipline, tended toward diagnosis rather than simply laying blame. That approach resonated with those American commanders who had been impatient with over-planning. Rehearsals were no longer mere theater. They were diagnostic tools that uncovered failure modes. The lesson was sobering. Rehearsal can reveal the worst-case scenarios, and confronting those scenarios could save lives on the real day. If Exercise Tiger taught the Allies to respect rehearsal as a clinical activity, Operation Fortitude taught them the power of deception. Fortitude was not a single trick, but a full-scale theatrical program. The British and their intelligence partners crafted a believable lie: a fictitious Allied army group poised to land at Pas-de-Calais. They employed inflatable tanks masquerading as armored divisions, phantom radio traffic to simulate troop movements, and double agents to feed Berlin a carefully choreographed story of impending attack elsewhere. The deception required routine discipline, leaks that seemed natural, signals that matched patterns German intelligence would expect, and a patient willingness to keep the fiction alive through small, believable touches. For American generals, the deception sometimes looked like artistry. One recorded reaction, attributed to Omar Bradley in private correspondence, captures the moment of stunned admiration. "Jesus Christ, they've thought of everything." Whether the phrase appears in exact words or in paraphrase in memoirs and notes, it marks a turning point. British deception did not guarantee success, but it redistributed risk. By convincing the German High Command to hold forces away from the real landing areas, fortitude reduced the immediate weight of opposition on the beaches. And yet, the Americans were not passive recipients of British methods. American mass and aggressiveness remained central to the invasion plan. The Anglo-American relationship around D-Day was not a teacher-pupil dynamic, but a crucible of mutual influence. British discipline gave structure to American initiative. American strength gave purpose to British meticulousness. Where British planners insisted on rehearsals and contingency lists, American generals pushed for flexibility in execution once contact occurred. The operation would rely on both. June 5 through 6, 1944 arrived with fog and the nervous, electric calm of an invasion force holding its breath. Some of what the Americans had resisted or mocked now revealed itself as matter-of-fact solution to immediate problems. The Mulberry Harbors, assembled under difficult conditions, became a logistical lifeline after initial storms and difficulties were negotiated. They did not single-handedly win the campaign. They were one of several elements that allowed the Allies to sustain a beachhead without immediate capture of a major port. Some duplex drive tanks reached the beaches, and, where they worked, they provided early armored support that otherwise would have been delayed. Hobart's devices did not perform perfectly across every sector. Some experiments failed, and some crews paid a high price. But the presence of armored means to support infantry immediately ashore was a tactical advantage that, in places and moments, mattered. Deception did its part too. German responses, shaped by the persistent fiction of a larger force in the Pas de Calais, meant divisions were not hurriedly redeployed to Normandy in strength. The Allies never achieved perfect surprise, but they shaped the conditions of battle with information and misdirection in ways that reduced the immediate opposition's ability to concentrate. The fog of war is not only about what is unknown to your commander. It is also about what you can make your enemy believe. The aftermath, hours, days, and weeks following D-Day, brought reflection. Omar Bradley, who had begun as cautious towards some British ideas, later acknowledged that certain innovations and the discipline behind them had been essential contributors to the invasion's survivability. Dwight Eisenhower, always balancing blunt practicality with strategic vision, continued to stress the virtue of thoroughness. His long experience with British planning since 1942 informed his respect for detail. Walter Bedell Smith's memos and organizational insistence remained an example of how paperwork and planning could reduce chaos. George S. Patton offers a more complicated figure in the arc.
Publicly, Patton had been used as a strategic deception, a visible commander stationed in Britain to suggest the location of the invasion. And privately, his temperament and impatient style at times clashed with British caution. He represented the American spirit of seizing opportunity and pressing forward. Reports suggest Patton initially viewed some British emphasis on procedure as timidity. Yet in the larger sweep, Patton's later reflections show appreciation for the value that disciplined planning added to the aggressiveness he prized. He never became a doctrinaire convert to meticulous rehearsal, but neither did he dismiss the practical gains that American forces enjoyed because of British preparation. There is a caution in celebrating the marriage of British planning and American drive too simplistically. The Allied victory at Normandy was contingent on countless variables: weather windows won and lost, amphibious craft, sheer weight of material, local commanders' decisions on the spot, and the stubborn heroism of soldiers in exposed surf and on mined beaches. To give any single innovation or culture sole credit would be to misunderstand the complexity of coalition warfare. Still, the arc of American reactions, from derision to grudging acceptance to deep respect, reveals how adaptability and humility can change strategy in war. Looking back, one can see particular lessons that those months impressed on American officers. First, logistics are not a secondary concern. They shape the possibilities of action. The Mulberry Harbors were a structural answer to a logistical problem. No port, no sustainment. Second, rehearsal and diagnostic testing can unmask hidden vulnerabilities. Exercise Tiger's tragedy underscored the human cost of failing to test assumptions. Third, deception is not sleight of hand, but a force multiplier. When properly executed, it changes enemy dispositions and opens operational windows. Fourth, innovation can be absurd at first glance. Hobart's funnies seemed eccentric, but their measured integration with sound tactical doctrine can reduce casualties and increase options. Those who lived through the planning and execution of D-Day remembered the cultural lessons long after the war. In staff rooms and quiet memoirs, American and British officers alike would joke and lament and praise. Among them arose a diplomatic summary that, while not a historical platitude, captured the balance. American forces taught the Allies how to punch harder on the beaches. British methods taught the Americans how to aim that punch with less waste. It is a tidy line, too neat if taken as doctrine, but it sums a practical truth. The alliance's strength came from complementary habits of mind. The story of American generals reacting to British readiness is also a human story of changing minds. Skepticism was not always prideful. It was often a sensible reaction to unfamiliar solutions in a high-stakes environment. Curiosity and pragmatism did the rest.
Men like Bradley and Bedale Smith, Eisenhower and Patton, different temperaments, different instincts, all arrived at a working consensus that no single national approach could bear the whole burden of invasion. The victory in Normandy was, in part, a victory of mutual learning. There are images that capture the feel of this exchange. A general squinting at a model of a floating pier, a skeptical laugh in a dingy hut, a tank with a flail approaching a mined lane, the grim aftermath of a failed rehearsal, inflatable decoys bobbing on a dark harbor to fool enemy reconnaissance. These pictures tell a practical lesson. In war, imagination coupled with meticulous execution can create space for audacity. The consequences reached beyond June 1944. The way logistics, deception, and rehearsal were integrated into campaign planning influenced later Allied operations in Europe. Officers who had been forced to rethink assumptions carried those lessons into staff colleges and planning rooms long after the beaches cooled. They taught a new generation that preparation does not dull aggression. Properly done, it enables it. If there is a final takeaway from the arc of reactions, it is this. The capacity to change one's mind when faced with convincing evidence is as valuable in command as any piece of equipment. The American generals who arrived skeptical in winter huts left Britain with a more complex, more capable conception of how to conduct a coalition invasion. That evolution, part practical, part moral, helped turn plans on paper into a tested reality on the sands of Normandy. If this exploration of how ideas and personalities shaped D-Day resonated with you, check the link to our deep dive on Operation Fortitude or the Mulberry Harbors in the description, and consider subscribing for more episodes that peel back the lesser-known choices behind the book moments of history.